Hello and welcome to another episode of the Looking After Nature podcast, bringing you close to nature and wildlife in Hampshire. My name's Andy Davidson and I'm here with my co-host and fellow ranger, Carly Harrod. Hi Carly.
Hi Andy. So today we're coming from the north of the county, which is a little bit out of my comfort zone, seeing as I live in Southampton. I get a little bit lost when I come up here. And we're here today to find out more about the fantastic Basingstoke Canal. Now Andy, I know you're quite familiar with the canal, aren't you?
Yes I am. In fact, we're not actually in Hampshire anymore, we're actually in Surrey.
Oh my gosh, I've left the county.
It's quite an amazing site. It's 32 miles long, winds through some beautiful countryside, and actually we're going to find out quite a lot hopefully from Fiona when we have a chat to her in a minute.
I've never been up here before. I've been up here for a training course and for a couple of meetings, but being like right down in the south, it's quite a long way to come, but I'm definitely going to come up and explore it. It looks beautiful today.
Hi Fiona, good to see you. The manager of the site here, aren't you?
Yeah, my title is Canal Manager, so I manage the Basingstoke Canal Authority. The Canal Authority is a partnership. We manage the whole of the canal for both of its owners. So half of the canal is owned by Hampshire County Council and half of it is owned by Surrey County Council. And obviously that can get really complicated across different counties and different policies and procedures. So we have the Basingstoke Canal Authority that then manage on behalf of those two owners. And we look after all of the operational day-to-day needs of the canal.
It's a fantastic place. I mean, it's amazing to think. It's quite beautiful here, and we're not actually far from the M3 and quite built up areas, are we?
Yeah, I think that's the great thing about the canal. It's that kind of green corridor, and people don't realise that it's here often, but you follow the canal right through some of the town centres like Fleet and Woking, and when you're on the canal, even in the middle of Woking for example, you wouldn't know you're in the middle of a town centre, and the same in Fleet as well. It's amazing how it just kind of sneaks through all these built up places, but giving this massive green resource for all of those people.
In our terms, it's probably quite an unusual site because it's someplace only a few metres wide, but how long is it?
So the canal is about 52 kilometres in total, so it's actually really huge. About 30, I'm going to swap between kilometres and miles here, but it's about 32 miles of that then is navigable. So we do have a section as well that's non-navigable, which means that boats can't go along it basically. That's what navigable means.
So I mean, it's clearly not a natural waterway, is it? I mean, it was built. When was it built and why was it built?
So it was completed back in 1794. So it's been around over 200 years now, so it's been here a very long time. It was originally built as an agrarian canal, which means it was there to take agricultural products. And obviously it's called the Basingstoke Canal, so originally it actually started in Basingstoke. It doesn't go that far, unfortunately, these days, but it went from Basingstoke and was basically taking those products right through down to the Wey, to the Thames, through to London. So it was very important in its time. Unfortunately, it was kind of built at the end, towards the end of the canal era, really, and of course the railways came along not long after. And I think the most profitable time for the canal was actually when it was helping build the railway along next to it, which happens with a lot of canals. And unfortunately, the canal over many years did fall into decline. And kind of eventually kind of finished up around going derelict in the sort of early mid-part 1950s-ish. Around that time it was actually derelict, unfortunately, but it was then the Canal Society was formed, the Basingstoke Canal Society was formed in the 1970s, and they basically lobbied the county councils at the time to take on the canal and buy it, and which they did so under the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act, and they took it on board. The society then spent about 20 to 30 years then basically restoring the whole of the canal, which was an absolutely massive job that had to happen, but they did that very successfully, and then they handed it over then to the newly formed Basingstoke Canal Authority in the early 90s, and here we are now, still going.
It's been restored now, but it's pretty still water. There's a little bit of flow. It's not like a normal natural river, is it?
No, not at all. The canal is very much a man-made waterway, and it acts very differently to a river. So I've got a great analogy for this that I can tell you, which I think is really helpful for people, and it's what the senior canal ranger actually told me when I started here many years ago now, and I've always used this description since. So basically the canal is different to a river in that the canal is very much like a bathtub. Okay, so imagine the taps are basically permanently on, but you never know whether the water is going to come out of them or not, and that's like the rain basically coming out of the sky. It's always there, it always could potentially fall, you don't know whether it's going there or not. But we have ways then of controlling the water in our bathtub. So if you remember, you've got that little overflow hole in your bath, the one that usually doesn't work very well, but actually you've got that little overflow and it's set at a certain level. And we have our weirs, our fixed crest weirs along the canal. So once the water in the canal reaches a certain level, we call that our datum 0. Once it reaches 0, the water will then top over our weirs and take that excess water away from the canal and into our local river systems. If it rains a lot, those taps are really on high and it's absolutely chucking it down, and we find that the weirs are not taking it off quicker enough. Basically, it's only a small hole, there's only so much meterage of weir, and the bath starts to fill up quicker than it's going out. What we can do is open sluices. Now the sluices in the bathtub are like your plug basically in the bottom, so you can open and close that plug as much as you want to try and let water out. Now you could get to a state where it's raining for so long and so heavy that even with the weir, the overflow running and the bath plug out, that the water in that bath is still coming up. So we have a cunning way of dealing with that. We actually look at the weather forecast. So before it rains, we're thinking about this way ahead. So before it rains, we say, well, how long is it going to rain for? What's the kind of level of waterfall are we looking at? And if it's looking that it's going to be prolonged, very heavy rain, what we'll actually do is lower the water level in the canal beforehand. And that's the beauty of a canal. With a river, you don't have that amount of control. Basically, the river flows. If it rains, it comes up and it floods if it gets too much. And you don't have that control over it. With the canal, actually you do. We lower levels down quite low. So we'll open our sluices way before it rains, let the water level drop down, so once it then starts to rain, we have a massive amount of availability in the canal for that to then gradually fill back up while it's raining, until it then gets to the weir point again where it goes over. So the beauty of that is that we load our local river systems before it actually rains. So if we were to wait till it actually rains and then load them up, we're just adding to that local flooding. We don't want to do that. And obviously we want to control the water level in the canal much more carefully. So by loading it in advance, by taking that water out, we're putting water into those rivers before there's a problem. That can flow away quite happily. And then we're adding all of that extra drainage capacity into the canal for that local area, and then we gradually fill back up again. There will be a point, of course, with it raining for weeks where the canal will fill back up again and we're then having to let it out of our sluices and weirs. But the majority of time we can control that quite carefully. So the majority of events we've got perfect control over that you wouldn't have next to a river. So actually it's probably much safer to live by a canal from a flooding perspective than it is to live near a river.
Yeah, so clearly there's a lot involved, isn't there?
Yeah, of course, and all of that management of that water is something we have to do every single day as well. So our canal ranger team have to go out and measure water levels along the canal every single day to keep an eye on what's happening with the fluctuating levels. We might not be raining here in Midship where we're standing right at this moment, but it could be raining further upstream in the canal in Odium. We don't see that, and suddenly our levels start to raise. So we need to keep a careful eye on those, and then careful eye obviously on the weather systems and what's coming in as well. And of course, opening in sluices and weirs, that's a constant. There's lots of them along the canal. We've got to be going around and managing those and upping and downing those levels appropriately. And of course, all of our weirs quickly get clogged up with leaves, particularly in the autumn time. Leaves and twigs that are falling naturally into the canal will clog them up. Within half an hour, the whole thing can reduce almost to half the capacity of the water going over it just because of the leaf matter. So we're constantly going around the canal. Obviously 32 miles navigable canal here. That's a lot of driving and a lot of time for our team to be able to go and clear those and keep them clear. So actually when there's heavy rain, lots of wind blowing leaves down and trees, there's a lot happening here on the canal to keep it all safe for everybody.
And that's because clearly it's a canal, it's there for the boats, and that's pretty much all about keeping the right level for the boats to go through, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why we have that sort of datum 0 that I mentioned earlier. That's the ideal level for the canal, where we're not going to overtop the canal, but we've got enough water for boats to pass through. The shape of the canal is actually a bit like a saucer, is a good way to kind of imagine it. So you're looking at about sort of 3 to 4 foot depth in the middle of the canal, but shallowing off very much at the sides. So if we drop too much in water level, actually the sides very quickly become very, very shallow, and you only have that narrow bit down the middle. So yeah, we want to keep our water levels as close to 0 as we possibly can through the year. Unfortunately, the canal here, the Basingstoke, has traditionally always suffered from low water levels, and I think right back in the late 1700s, soon after the canal had opened, it did close one summer there because they didn't have enough water to feed it, and that's something we still suffer from today. It often means that there's a few weeks or a month in the summer where we're not able to have boats coming on and off and visiting the canal, which is a real shame. Our main water source actually comes from the springs under the Greywall Tunnel at the top end of the canal. And that's where most of our water comes from. We have a couple of inlet feeders as well coming into the canal, but we rely very much on those. Other canals often are quite near a river system where they can take water off rivers as well, or they have big summit pounds where they have big storages of water. Unfortunately, they took a lot of shortcuts when they made the Basingstoke Canal, and they didn't build those kind of things into it. So once the spring levels, the underground aquifers, reduce down, then we get a lot less water coming in, and our levels will quickly drop down. And particularly in the height of summer where it's hot, you've got a lot of evaporation. The trees, the canal is beautiful because of its tree-lined nature, but all of those trees are sucking water out of the ground, out of the canal as well, and our water levels can drop very, very rapidly over, you know, a matter of very hot days in the summertime. So yeah, it's a difficult thing, unfortunately, but yeah, we could really do with some more water. So we're generally pretty happy on the canal actually when it rains, particularly in the summer. We're the only people celebrating at that time, probably.
So we say it was originally built to take the agricultural products and things like that along, and they would have been horse-drawn barges, but clearly there's none here now. We've got a couple of, it's like narrow boats up the side here, moored here.
Yeah, we've got lots of nice narrow boats on the canal. So we have various sort of areas for mooring along the canal, and we have narrow boats and smaller cabin cruisers and things that moor up here, and they have that as their sort of permanent home mooring. So this is not for people to live on board their boats, it's for people to sort of store their boats and come and use them for recreation and take them up and down the canal. The great thing about the Basingstoke Canal is once you get above we have flights of locks on the canal, we call them flights, and that's sets of locks in a row basically that you go through to obviously move uphill very gradually. That's the whole point of locks. Once you've passed the first 28 locks on the canal, which are all down in the Surrey end of the canal, you then actually get to a massive pound. A pound is what we call a big section of water between locks. You get to a really big pound, and in that whole pound then you've got a good 16 or more miles where you've only got then one lock actually to have to go through, and it makes it really easy boating for people. Now some people love going through the locks, and that's great. They can be hardcore going through those locks if they want. There's big flights that they can travel through, but actually if you just want some nice easy days cruising up and down the canal, watching the kingfishers, seeing the herons, watching the damselflies and dragonflies coming and sitting on your boat as you're travelling along, then the Hampshire Pound is absolutely amazing for that, and it makes it a really popular place for people to want to have their boats.
Because they're definitely not speedboats, are they? These are generally a slow pace of life, isn't it?
Yeah, everything happens very slowly on the canal, and even with maintenance of the canal, sometimes we need to get boats from one place to another, but it can take a day or so just to move the boat to the location to do that job. And it can make it, yeah, very, very tricky. So yeah, it's very much a slower pace of life. We have a sort of speed limit on the canal, which is basically sort of a fast walking pace, was how you would kind of describe that. And you're not allowed to make a breaking wash behind you, because that breaking wash can obviously go and erode the banks of the canal, which we already have a lot of erosion just from the day-to-day use on the canal. So yeah, we don't want them to go too fast, or that causes more damage.
I used to live in the area. I've actually kayaked on the canal. I probably didn't have a permit. You need a permit to do that, don't you?
No. Yes, the canal, because as I've just been talking about, we've got this big pound without any locks. It makes it fantastic for unpowered boats. So canoes, kayaks, paddle boards are all the rage obviously these days. A lot of those inflatable kayaks these days are a lot better quality than they used to be, than the old rubber dinghies that they had in the good old days. But actually, yeah, so it's so popular for unpowered boats. So yeah, people do need a licence from us. Anybody who uses the waterway actually needs a licence of some sort from us. You can't just go on and use it. But we want people to use the canal. We want people to enjoy it. We want people to get out and have, you know, that outdoor sport, the access to outdoor recreation. The canal's absolutely perfect for that. Conveniently, we've just written a book, actually, a paddle sport guide to the canal, which you can get online, and that basically tells you all the great places to go and park and access the canal and different kind of trips that you can do. We had a massive increase in unpowered boat use this summer, obviously with COVID. People have gone out and suddenly bought all these new canoes and kayaks because it was like one of the few things that they were allowed to do locally. So we've had a whole new load of people who've come and discovered the canal through wanting to find somewhere to go out paddling. And I think it's great. I mean, paddling is very low impact on the canal, but really huge enjoyment output, basically. And all of those, for our day, just for a simple day licence for the canal, is only £3 a day. For that, you know, where do you get a whole day out for £3? And if there's two of you in the boat, it's only £1.50 each. It's an absolute bargain. But you know what, even though it's a small amount, and we've put new signage up this year, all of that really does add up. So it's really helped our finances for the canal this year to have all of those unpowered boats and all those little £3 adding up and helping our revenue budget, where we desperately need money to then look after the canal long term, because a canal is not a cheap thing to look after. As a heritage asset, there's a lot of assets along the canal, a lot of features that we need to maintain in a traditional way, and of course those things don't come cheaply.
Clearly, I mean, there's quite a lot of people on the towpaths. It's used as it's a walking route as well, isn't it?
Of course, yes. So we've got the towpath, runs right through, even into the unnavigable bit of the canal where the boats can't go anymore. The towpath runs right through there and right through to, well, it goes right from the River Way down in Byfleet, right through to up Nately in Hampshire. And yeah, it's a fantastic walking route. A lot of people do it as a challenge route as well and see if they can walk it all, you know, in a day. And people do it as a paddling challenge route as well, and sometimes even including all of the lock portages, which is quite hard work to get in and out around all of those locks, so it's very hard work. But yeah, the canal is so well used, cyclists, walkers, dog walkers, and particularly again now during COVID we've had an awful lot of use. We had, I think we did some measurements of some counters and things down in the Woking part of the canal, and we found we'd actually had a 300% increase in cycle use alone on the towpath in that area. And of course on top of that all of the extra pedestrians as well, and the dog walkers and the runners. Unfortunately the canal towpath is quite a narrow space, and it does make it quite difficult sometimes because there's a lot of people, all different types of users, wanting to use this very narrow space. So certainly sort of the most popular areas can get quite busy sometimes, but there's also a lot of very rural parts of the canal where you're not going to see as many people, and you can definitely have that quieter experience. And of course the towpath is ideal for commuting as well, because the railway line that was built along it, we've actually got quite a few railway stations quite near the canal. So people will, who live nearby will use it to walk or bike to the train stations to get to work, and sometimes use the train stations as ways of helping them walk the canal in sections as well, and then travelling back again afterwards. So that's pretty handy too.
And you've got fishing clubs here as well, haven't you? There's a lot going on here. Yeah,
so again, as I was talking about the different users on the towpath, obviously the fishermen and women who use the canal obviously are on the edge of that towpath as well. And yeah, we have the Basingstoke Canal Angling Association, who currently have the rights to the angling on the canal. So they're quite a big club and have access to the rights all the way along the canal.
So it's clearly highly valued by all the users, but it's, of course, most of it is a special scientific interest, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely, and it's one of the things that makes the canal very, very special. There's not many canals around the country that are actually a site of special scientific interest. Here at the Basingstoke Canal, we were designated, we have basically this really unusual water chemistry. So from where the water comes out of the springs under the Greywell Tunnel, and emerges, that's basically at that end of the canal, it's very alkaline, and up there we get really clear waters where you can see the fish swimming around in there below you, and it travels along the distance of the canal, heading through down into Surrey and down to towards the River Way. It gradually changes into an acidic pH level, and what makes it so special is we get all of the water-based vegetation that's associated with all of those different levels of pH basically as it goes along, and that's what makes it really, really special, because you don't normally get all of that within one continuous water body. It's very, very unusual. Yeah, but that's obviously all to do with the soils and the geological types that we're passing through this area. But yeah, it makes it really special. The other reason for the designation is because of our damselflies and dragonfly population. We have a huge number of the species that you get to see within the UK here. You can see them along the canal, and it's a really great place, and particularly if you're out paddling, they'll often come and sit on your canoe or your kayak as you're going along, particularly if you're here in the middle of the summer. You know, July, August time's a really great time to see them. I usually like to go up through through Crookham village, and up through to sort of Barleymow, Winchfield up there. That's a really good area for seeing the dragonflies zipping around above you hunting, and obviously then emerging out on the reeds on the side of the canal as well. So we're talking about it comes out the chalk at Greywell, and it's almost gin clear up there, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's quite dark here. I suppose it's quite peaty from the heaths as well.
Yeah, the Surrey heaths, yeah. So it's a much more obviously acidic down through this area, so yeah, and it's much more cloudy as a result. But actually this year, again, has been really different, and it's been really interesting because we didn't have the powered boat use this year. All our trip boats had to stop operating because of COVID. We weren't able to have people coming through on their boats and staying overnight, the visiting boats that would normally come on and off the canal through the summer. What's happened is basically that the bed of the canal has been churned up less without these engines going up and down the canal. That sort of had some positive and negative effects for the canal, really. So the positive is that actually we've had a lot less turbidity in the canal. The turbidity basically is sort of how muddy the water is. So if you look down and it's looking a bit muddy and you can't see very far down, then it's quite turbid. And if you can see right to the bottom, it's not very turbid at all. And we can measure that with a fancy disc we have called a Secchi disc, and we can drop that in and you measure what point that disc disappears. Now actually I don't even need a Secchi disc right now because I'm standing looking into the canal right now, and yeah, we can pretty much see the bottom of the canal, can't we?
Yeah,
it's always a bit of a treasure hunt because you see all sorts of things that have disappeared into the canal over time that suddenly reappear. Anyway, yeah, so what's happened is it's just become much clearer. And what was interesting was we were due for our vegetation survey this summer. We do them every 4 years, on the canal. So what we did is, because we'd had this sort of anomaly year almost, we said, well, what we really need right now is a full canal turbidity survey to sort of give us an idea of what's the canal like without powered boats on it, to give us kind of this baseline year. We would probably never get this ever again.
Yeah.
So working with a team of intrepid volunteers who volunteered to go out in their canoes, we actually did measurements of turbidity with our Secchi discs every 250 metres down the full length of the canal over a couple of weeks, and we timed that in at the same time that we were having our vegetation survey carried out as well. So all those results are going to be comparable. So that's going to be really interesting. I haven't got the results of that yet. They're due out very soon. We'll be able to look at that. And what we plan to do then is sort of compare those results with previous surveys on boat use and things like that, and start to learn a bit more about what affects the canal's turbidity. And that turbidity then can affect obviously the growth of plants, because even water-based plants need the sunlight to photosynthesize. So it's really important. So all these things are all interlinked, as well as like how much shading the canal gets from the trees, as are we going to get the vegetation growing up along the banks, and there's a lot of intricate stuff here, and we don't fully know exactly how all of these things interact. So there's some studies going to be going on as a result of this. There has been the downside of not having the powered boats as well, because the boats will normally go down the centre of the canal, and they create kind of a weed box area, we call it, basically, where any weeds that would normally be growing in that area, the propellers will chop those up, and you get basically a clear channel down the centre of the canal, whereas then you get the reed growth and the nice vegetation growing up on the side, which is fantastic for the wildlife in those shallower areas. And you get this beautiful combination. Like if you were going to create a garden pond, you would want nice shallow areas around the edge with a little deeper area in the middle that's kept free from all that weed growth. Otherwise it gets clogged up and things can't grow and it goes really stagnant. The canal's kind of in the same in a way, and it's really good to have those powered boats coming through because they keep that nice open water area, which is really important. Obviously we've got the fish in the canal as well. They need that open water and they need that sunlight and oxygen just as the plants do. So what we've found is without the powered boats is that the underwater vegetation has grown quite rampant in areas. And unfortunately, the things that grow the fastest and the quickest tend to be the invasive species, the non-native invasives that we don't want on the canal. And we spend an awful lot of time managing those. And I've seen, as a paddler on the canal, I'm kind of looking down in some of our big wide bits of the canal we call flashers, and looking at those, and I can see some of the invasive species have grown right out across the canal now. So we're going to have some trouble with them for the next couple of years, with those getting wrapped around people's propellers and trying to knock those back again to sort of regain our control over that kind of nice clear water channel through those areas.
Because those invasive species, I mean, they're quite a problem with a lot of freshwaters in particular, aren't they? Because they're called invasive non-natives because they've been brought over from abroad, and where they are naturally living, there's things that eat them and there's things that keep them under control. They don't have the same thing here, do they? No,
absolutely not. I mean, one of the worst ones that we spend probably the most amount of time and effort on controlling at the moment is floating pennywort, and unfortunately we have that on the lower half of the canal in the Surrey area below Lock 7, so in the sort of Woking section and the Woodham section of the canal. It can grow, I believe, is up to about 20 centimetres a day from tiny fragments, and it absolutely can cover the canal in a whole blanket. And it can be very, very thick as well, to the point where you almost you need mechanical aid basically to pull that out. We have a weed cutter, restored weed cutter on the canal, which we use, and we weren't able to get it out early in the season because of COVID again, so we weren't able to get on it at the early part in the sort of late winter, early spring when we normally would. And unfortunately it then grew like crazy, and then when it came to a time when we were able to get volunteers back out again, it had got to become this absolutely massive mountain, literally, of a job to try and clear it. And of course that will actually stop boats coming up, even if they were then allowed at that point, because we don't have clear water for them to travel through. So it was really important to get down there and to try and clear it and knock it back. But we spend, you know, months and months clearing the floating pennywort out of the canal, and it's an ongoing long-term job. The main thing we're trying to do at the moment is contain it so that it doesn't break out anywhere else on the canal. So the best we can do at the moment is contain and control and keep on top of it as much as we possibly can. We've found in the past that really cold winters really help knock it back and really give us a good advantage, but we've found really you need quite thick ice on the canal for at least 2 weeks in the winter for it really to have that big effect. And when we get those kind of winters, it's fantastic because it makes our life a lot easier. We can get in and clear it much quicker in the late winter and then be on top of it, and then the job is just ticking it over, keeping on top of it. Whereas once we get those warm winters and things start to grow and keep growing, you know, in theory it probably should stop growing around August, September, but it doesn't. It just keeps going with these mild winters. And then we just have such a job, it's really, really hard to keep on top of it. So, yeah, so much volunteer, you know, manpower goes into keeping on top of that. It's really, really hard job. And obviously we've got other invasive species on the canal as well, and trying to maintain those as well. And so there's a lot of our time is spent dealing with these things that shouldn't really even be here.
Quite often there might be somebody's got a garden pond or something and they're just filling it in. They think, I need to do something with the plants. I'll just put it in the canal, that's fine, isn't it?
Oh my goodness, no. Oh, you know, and we had actually a bit of an outbreak of floating pennywort up in Fleet, because just that we found there was a suspicious pot, let's say, found floating in the canal, and at the same point we then had an outbreak of a floating pennywort.
Yeah.
That's part of its Latin name. Yeah, you know, it grows so quickly that you know it came from that same area, and we had to jump on that, all volunteers into that area, checking on it, removing tiny bits. We go in with litter pickets, pulling out tiny little fragments. We go in with nets. We armed all of our volunteer lengthsmen who walk sections of the canal for us every week with nets so they could scoop any bits out. And we're really, even now, and that was 3 or 4 years ago now, even now we're still keeping a really close eye on that area and making sure if there's anything cropping up in that area, we're pulling it straight out, because that could almost, you know, destroy really all our wildlife through that whole upper section, 16 miles of canal, if that catches hold through there. So it's vitally important to be really on it if we get any outbreaks. And we really do think that was somebody just chucking their plant pot out of the garden pond, just throwing it in the canal. Oh my goodness, it's an absolute
just little
nightmare.
Things like that, isn't it?
Yeah, could really affect everything. They just don't realise.
And clearly volunteers are, you know, they're at the heart of everything you do, it sounds like, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like all countryside sites these days, we rely very, very heavily on volunteers. We have the Basingstoke Canal Society, obviously, who originally did the restoration of the canal, we still work alongside very closely with their volunteers and their volunteer teams. And we have other teams as well who work directly for us. And between us all on the canal with volunteers, we're able to run trip boats and raise additional revenue income from the canal. All of that comes straight back in towards helping us, as well as all of the trip boats. We have work boats that are driven by volunteers. So again, if I need to move a work boat because a tree's come down and we need to go and deal with it, you know, a day's journey, you know, a day for staff time, instead I can ask volunteers to go and move that boat for us, allow my staff to carry on with other work. And the volunteers love it. You know, they get to drive all sorts of different types of boats. Everybody is fully trained up. We've got fully trained crew, all of the things that go with that. So they're getting loads out of it, and we are benefiting massively. Obviously, all of the time removing invasive species that we've already been talking about as well. But yeah, we would be totally lost without volunteers on the canal. But I do like, you know, we've got hundreds of them, but we always need more. You know, really, we couldn't manage the canal without them. Absolutely vital.
We talked about the water plants and the dragonflies, but there's also, because you've got the grey wall tunnel, which is very important, isn't it, for wildlife?
Yeah, the grey wall tunnel is a triple SI in its own right. I believe, off the top of my head, I think it's either the 3rd or the 4th biggest bat hibernaculum within Europe, and that shows how important it is. The grey wall tunnel is at the sort of the top end of the canal. Unfortunately, you can't go through the grey wall tunnel anymore. It did have a collapse there many years ago, so it's completely blocked off. And that's basically sort of what cut off the top bit of the canal that's not navigable now up Nately. But yeah, it became basically a huge bat hibernaculum. So yeah, fantastic for bat species, and the local bat group do regular surveys up there and have been monitoring the bats there for many years.
And that's all down to the collapse, isn't it? Because I mean, when it was a tunnel, there was air passing through all the time.
Yeah.
And it wasn't really suitable for a big bat roost. But
Yeah,
now it's a bat cave, basically.
Yeah,
isn't
basically
it?
a massive bat cave. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people still talk about whether we could one day reopen the Great Wall Tunnel and reopen the top end of the canal, but unfortunately, I think the bats would have something to say about that, and probably Natural England would as well.
Yeah, as we've been talking, it's quite a long site, and it goes through all sorts of countryside. Where's your favourite place on the canal?
Oh, that's really difficult. It's like asking who your favourite child is or something like that, isn't it? I love all of the canal. I think it's fantastic, but I guess I have to admit, I'm quite sad. On my days off, I still go to the canal because I'm a really keen paddler, and I've certainly paddled it several times over this summer. But probably the spot I always think is my favourite that I'll go for a paddle is probably between Crookham Wharf car park, probably up towards Barleymow in Winchfield. I think that's a really beautiful rural stretch of the canal. You're always going to see kingfishers through there, which is fab. And again, it's got some, as well as being tree covered, it's got some really nice open sections as well. So again, I like to watch all the dragonflies and damselflies through there. So I think that's probably my favourite spot. It's got a little bit of everything up there, I would say.
Yeah, probably should say, I mean, as a former kayaker myself, when we say paddling, we're not rolling our trouser legs up, are we? We're going...
Of course not, no. Unfortunately, swimming in the canal is against the bylaws.
Oh, right.
So, yeah, unfortunately, you're not allowed to swim in the canal. But obviously, if you happen to fall in and have to swim to the edge to get back out, obviously, that's
not
perfectly
illegal,
acceptable.
no.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely not. And obviously, we have as well as people just coming and paddling recreationally, we have three canoe clubs associated with the canal. Two of them are based here. We've got the Basingstoke and Dean Canoe Club up at Odium, at Colt Hill in Odium, and we've got the Basingstoke Canal Canoe Club based here at Mitchett, and then also we have the Blackwater Valley Canoe Club. They don't have a base here, but they regularly use the canal as well, and all of those clubs work together quite a lot and obviously run training courses and have lots of boats and equipment. So if you're wanting to get into paddling, that's a really great way to start off.
Fantastic. Well, it's been great to come out and see you up
It
here
is.
and on such a beautiful section of the canal as well. So good to see you.
No problem. Happy to have you. It's good to see some real people.
So Andy, you talked with Fiona about her favourite place on the canal, but do you have one?
Well, actually, I did used to live in the area, and I do love a place near Odium. It's up towards what's called King John's Castle. There's this ruin. It's a hunting lodge rather than a massive castle, but it's a ruin now. And it's called King John's Castle because he was supposed to stop there on his way to Runnymede to Slender Carter. And there's a lovely stretch that goes from the castle up towards the Great Wall Tunnel, and it's absolutely beautiful. So that's my favourite spot.
Cool.
So I just mentioned the Great Wall Tunnel because we know that because we've got the towpath over there, which was where the horses used to walk with a big rope behind them towing the boats along. But when you get to the tunnel, there's no towpath. Do you know how they got the boats through?
No.
Well, he did a thing called legging it, and basically they lie a board on the back of the boat, and there's a man on both ends of the board with their feet facing outwards, and they walk it through the tunnel. So they, how long? It's about half a mile long, I think, the tunnel. And I think they go about. It takes about half an hour for them to walk it through.
So legging it isn't about running away from something?
I think probably it's a different phrase, but it just sounds the same. But that was called legging it.
Ah. So freshwater habitats are amazing, but did you know that freshwater only accounts for 3% of the world's water?
Yeah, 3%. It's amazing. I mean, clearly most of the rest of it is saltwater in the oceans.
Yeah, the rest is saltwater. But despite that only 3%, freshwater habitats are home to more than 100,000 species of plants and animals. I think that's amazing.
It is, and it's an amazing wildlife resource. And actually, I mean, you might not be able to get the Basingstoke Canal in your garden, but one of the best things you can do in your garden is put a little pond in, and it's amazing what you'll get turning up. Some of the dragonflies and things like we've talked about recently.
Yeah, I'm going to add one to my garden because I keep seeing a few dragonflies, and I live miles away from any water, so I will be seeing what comes this summer.
Yeah, it's a great thing to do. So that brings us to the end of this episode of Looking After Nature, the Hampshire Countryside Service podcast. Don't forget to subscribe for more nature, conservation and wellbeing content.
We'd love to hear from you with any comments or thoughts, or if there's anything you'd like us to discuss in a future episode. Let us know by tweeting us or messaging us on Facebook and Instagram.
And we'd really appreciate it if you'd rate and review our podcast on iTunes, as it helps other people find us.
In the meantime, check out our social media pages for more relevant updates and loads of fun information about the Basingstoke Canal this month.
For now, thanks again for listening. I'm Andy Davidson.
And I'm Carly Harrod. See you next time.